welcome to New Covenant United Methodist Church here in lovely Farmington, New Mexico. My name is Tinker, and I am so glad you can join us as we continue our sermon series on God's creative connection. Our text today is from Genesis chapter 22, and we'll be reading verses 1 through 14. Let me go ahead and read it. After these events, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." Abraham answered, "I'm here." God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him up as an entirely burnt offering there on one of the mountains that I will show you." Abraham got up early in the morning, harnessed his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him. Together with his son Isaac, he split the wood for the entirely burnt offering, set out, and went to the place God had described to him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place at a distance. Abraham said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will walk there, worship, and then come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the entirely burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. He took the fire and the knife in his hand, and the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." Abraham said, "I'm here, my son." Isaac said, "Here is the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the entirely burnt offering?" Abraham said, "The lamb for the entirely burnt offering? God will see to it, my son." The 2 of them walked on together. They arrived at the place God had described to him. Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He tied up his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. But the Lord's messenger called out to Abraham from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" Abraham said, "I'm here." The messenger said, "Don't stretch out your hand against the young man and don't do anything to him. I know now that you revere God and didn't hold back your son, your only son, from me." Abraham looked up and saw a single ram caught by its horns in the dense underbrush. Abraham went over, took the ram, and offered it as an entirely burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham named that place, "The Lord Sees." That is the reason people today say, "On this mountain, the Lord is seen." Well, if this passage bothers you, if you really struggle with it, you're in good company. A lot of people have come to me and told me, "I don't know that I can worship a God that would ask a parent to sacrifice their child." It's a very troubling passage, and it doesn't seem consistent with what we know of God, does it? God is a loving God, and so how could he ask somebody to do something so barbaric? And so there's this inconsistency with it, as if it almost doesn't belong in the Bible. And so we really struggle with this passage. And if you're one of those, you're in good company, because most people do really struggle with this. Scholars really struggle with this. There's a lot of theological debate surrounding this passage. And if you look at any commentary on Genesis, you will note that this particular section of Genesis takes up a good bit more real estate than most other passages in Genesis. So it is very troubling. So I want to talk about that troubling aspect of it, that barbaric aspect of it. And please know, I don't have all the right answers, and I'm not convinced I'm right. I can tell you I've done more research on this particular passage than any passage that I've probably preached on before. And I'm still just not convinced I've got everything right. But I've got it to a point where I'm comfortable understanding it a little bit better. I can reconcile it a little bit better than I could before. And so I want to share that with you, and maybe it will help you as well. So one of the first things I want to do is talk about the barbaric nature of it right from the get-go. Let's just get that out of the way. So God asked Abraham to sacrifice his child. Man, that's hard, very, very hard. And we all probably read that and say, "Man, I hope God never tests me like that, because I'm going to flunk." And I can't believe God did that. Well, to understand it a little bit better, and I'm not convinced this is perfect understanding of it, but to understand a little bit better, we at least have to admit that we aren't Abraham, that we don't live in that time period and in that culture. And if we look at the culture that Abraham was living in and the time period he was living in, child sacrifice was not as big a deal as it is to us now. We live on this side of the law. We know now that child sacrifice isn't consistent with God's nature. I mean, we're right there. It isn't consistent. God in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, that's one of the things that he several times mentions that he does not want the people of Israel to do. As a matter of fact, he even tells them, if you catch someone else doing it, put them to death. And he calls it an abomination. He is totally against child sacrifice. The thing is, Abraham may not know that. Abraham's living before the law. And he is living in a culture in Canaan where child sacrifice is practiced, where it is the norm, where it is accepted. And if we think, well, boy, I'm sure glad that, well, that was the Stone Ages and we don't do that anymore. Just want you to know that actually it has been practiced all the way until at least the 1400s in Europe. And is still practiced in some areas of the world. And from a global historical point of view, it is very widespread and has been practiced throughout a tremendous amount of history. So this isn't an isolated thing to Canaan in one particular time period. This was something that's very global and transcends time. I can remember actually when I was in Europe as an exchange student being shown castles and told, there's the spot where the king buried his firstborn child to help secure the walls. They believed that by sacrificing a child, it would make the walls stronger, that God, or the gods, whatever they were serving, would honor that sacrifice and then protect them because of that sacrifice. And so it's very heartbreaking to know that even back in the medieval time period in Europe, we were seeing still child sacrifice, because that's definitely post the Mosaic law, and they certainly would have been familiar with the law of Moses and known that God did not like child sacrifice being done. So child sacrifice to Abraham would not have been so alien, at least not from a cultural standpoint. We don't know what his relationship with God was in the sense that God told him that he didn't like it, but certainly from a cultural surrounding aspect, it would have been part of Abraham's worldview. Now, still hard to accept and understand, but at least we do understand that it might not have been so alien to Abraham to hear God ask that, because he saw the other gods, they weren't real gods, but the other gods asking for child sacrifice. The second thing we need to remember, and this comes out of the biblical record itself, is that Abraham had a promise that Isaac would be the father of many nations. God had promised Abraham that he was going to be the father of many nations, and he had the one legitimate son. He didn't even know anymore where Ishmael was at this point. Remember, he's already driven Hagar and Ishmael away, so has no idea if where Ishmael is. He probably presumes that Ishmael is alive because God made that promise, but he doesn't know where he's at. So he has Isaac, and God has told him, it's through Isaac that I will name your descendants. So that's the promise he has. So when God tells him to sacrifice Isaac, he probably hears it in his head a little bit different than we hear it, because he also had this promise that Isaac had to live to be the father of children. So it isn't so much that God's asking him to kill his son as it is God asking him, do you trust me to raise your son from the dead? And we get that from Hebrews. The author of Hebrews tells us that by faith, Abraham offered Isaac when he was tested. The one who received the promises was offering his only son. He had been told concerning him, "Your legitimate descendants will come from Isaac." He figured that God could even raise him from the dead. So even in the time of Jesus, just shortly after Jesus, this is the way biblical scholars were interpreting that passage. They were seeing that as whether Abraham trusted God to raise Isaac from the dead, not to test whether he could kill him, but whether he trusted God to raise him from the dead. So it's a slightly different way of looking at it. It still doesn't take the sting out of it, especially as a parent, but it is a little bit different than just saying, hey, do you love God enough to go kill your son? Or do you love God enough to trust that he can raise your son from the dead? So it is a little bit different. Well, understanding the context and the worldview of Abraham may still not really solve our concerns with this passage. And so at the end of the day, what we may have to do is say, you know what, I'm going to have to trust that God chose the best test for Abraham. God knew the situation. He knew the people involved. He knew the culture and the time frame. And he knew this was the best way to test Abraham. So we just have to trust it was right. Well, now I recognize that this passage brings up some questions, and I want to address some of those questions. And the first one is, does God ever test us? And certainly, does God ever test us like he did Abraham? And I have to tell you, scholars are pretty divided over whether God tests us or not. Now, I fall on the side that God does use situations to test us. And so you'll see that in my response as well. But one of the things that I do often see when scholars are debating whether God tests us or tempts us, or when I hear people talking about it, is that sometimes they tend to overlap testing and temptation, and they're two different things. And I don't believe God tempts us. The Bible says that God does not tempt us. We can look in James 1 for that. But I do believe that God tests us. And so the difference really between testing and temptation, let's look at testing first. Testing is when we're presented a difficult situation and we have to make decisions about how to respond to that situation, and the decisions can either be godlike or human-like. So do we respond with what we've learned from God, with the mindset and the heart that God has given us and worked on in our lives, or do we default back to our human nature and respond that way? And so I think that's, I got that from another pastor. I think that's a good way of looking at a test. So it's a challenging situation where we may have to make a choice. And often when we look at the biblical record of when God tested people, he actually told them the right answer as well. And when we look in Deuteronomy, when God is leading the Israelites through the desert, there are several places where God says, do you choose life or do you choose death? If you choose this route, it leads to life. If you choose this route, it leads to death. Here's the test, make your choice. And he's already told them which choice leads to life and which one leads to death, which one's the right one and which one's the wrong one. So a test is a choice to do a godly way of responding to something or a human way of responding to something. Now, a temptation is different because it's an enticement to do something wrong, to sin. So it's a lure. And it is almost always associated with Satan. When we see the word that is translated to temptation in the Bible, very close to that word, you also see the word Satan. So it is Satan that tempts. Matter of fact, James, in his book in the Bible, makes it very clear God will never tempt us. But it is not in God's nature to tempt us. But that God does test us. James does say that God tests us. And that we should rejoice in being tested, because testing is what builds endurance. And Peter talks about testing building character. So testing appears to be an important part of our spiritual growth. And the Psalms, we actually have Psalms where the psalmists ask God to test them, to purify them, because they want to grow spiritually and be stronger. So testing is something that we want to happen in our spiritual walk. Temptation is unfortunately something we wish wouldn't happen, but does happen. But we don't want to confuse the two because they are very different. So testing and temptation are a little bit different. We have to acknowledge God doesn't tempt us, but he may test us. The big question that scholars have on testing is whether God actually sets up tests or whether he uses situations to test us. And at the end of the day, really what we're doing is kind of splitting theological hairs because God is sovereign. Now, I do believe God gives us free will, and I don't believe God makes all the bad things and the bad situations happen in our lives, but he allows things to happen or not happen. The good news is that God uses those tests to grow us, to make us stronger. So a great thing about the Bible is that usually in both the Old Testament and the New Testament we have different words for testing and temptation. So most translations will have those words correct. You'll see testing or you'll see temptation and be able to tell what the original word was and what's being talked about. Just don't confuse testing as temptation and temptation as testing. Now, one of the questions you might ask yourself at this point is, why does God even test us if he already knows the answer? And my response would be, well, does he? I mean, in this situation, in this particular passage, God's response to Abraham is, now I know. Now I know that you revere God. And I don't think he would have said that if he had known exactly what Abraham was going to do. So I believe God has chosen, by giving us free will, he has also chosen to limit his knowledge of the future. God could know everything we're going to do, but I think God has chosen to not know, to give us more free will. And so we get to make some of our own decisions. But even if God knew how Abraham was going to respond, Abraham didn't. And we've already talked about how testing is about growth. And so God is giving Abraham the opportunity to know where he is, to grow his faith, even if God knew. So that's how I would respond to that question. The next question that would come up is, how do I know I'm being tested? It could be a whole new sermon, and there's so many questions here actually. It could lead to new sermons. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time there today. Just know that if it's not a temptation, it's probably a test. And there can be some blend. There can be some bleeding over. And this is why scholars struggle a little bit between the difference between testing and tempting. For example, if you were walking along and you saw a $20 bill on the ground, you could say that's a temptation to pick it up and keep it. Or you could say, well, it's a test. Am I going to pick it up and turn it in? Or am I going to keep it? And so you could argue that that's a test or it's a temptation. So again, getting into the nuances of that could be another whole sermon. And so what I really want to kind of talk about is, let's acknowledge that we are tested, and whether it's a test or a temptation, we can respond successfully. And I want to go there. I want to talk about how to respond successfully to a test. And we have Abraham here giving us a great example of how to do that. And I picked up 3 things that I saw Abraham do in this passage that I think are really important for us. And the first thing I saw that he did is that he didn't debate with God. And Abraham had a track record of debating with God. It's amazing, actually, that Abraham didn't debate with God on this one. If you think back, Abraham is the one that when the 3 men came, and it turned out that they were God and 2 angels, but they came to him at the Oaks of Mamre, and he's having a conversation with them, and he feeds them, and they give him the announcement that Sarah's going to have a child in a year. Afterwards, they then talk to him about the fact they're going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And how does Abraham respond? He begins to bargain with God. He asks God, well, if you find 50 people there that are righteous, are you still going to destroy it? And God says, no, I won't. And then Abraham just continues. He said, how about 45? And then 30, then 20, and then 10. So he continues to bargain with God, debate with God about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. And we saw the same thing just last week when God came to Abraham and said, in a year Sarah's going to have a child. And the first response that Abraham has is, why don't you just bless Ishmael instead? Bless Ishmael. So he kind of debates with God. And Abraham does that quite a bit. In this case, we see that Abraham has grown a lot. And he doesn't debate with God at all. He just does what God asked him to do. He just gets it done quietly. And the reason I think this is important for us is that when we start debating stuff, we eventually convince ourselves that that's not even what God said, isn't it? I mean, when we start debating back and forth, we really are trying to argue our point till we convince ourselves that we're right. And so it's kind of a delay tactic. I'll just keep on arguing with God until I've convinced myself that I'm more right and God's more wrong. And then we just talk ourselves completely out of ever obeying in the first place. So I think that's an important thing for us to remember is when we're tested is not to spend time debating it. Now, it's one thing to debate whether or not God's actually asked us to do something. Again, a whole nother sermon. But once we know that God has asked us to do something, if we start debating it, we're going to talk ourselves out of it. It's just a delaying tactic. And we're going to eventually, we've already decided in our mind really that we don't want to do it. And we just kind of keep presenting new arguments until we convince ourselves that we're right to not do it. And so we don't want to go down that route, and we don't see Abraham doing that here. And so we definitely want to imitate Abraham in this situation by just not arguing with God and just doing what we're told to do. The second thing I see Abraham doing in this passage that I think is important for us to emulate as well is he didn't delay. When God told him to sacrifice his son, he got up, the text says he got up early the next morning, saddled his donkey, got the wood together, and then set out. Don't we like to delay? When God asked us to do something, God didn't put a time period on when Abraham had to leave. But you know that if he'd waited and waited and waited, eventually he would have gotten to the point where he said, did God ask me to do something? I don't remember. I don't remember exactly what God asked me to do. And you know what? God must not have been serious about it because he hasn't come back and said anything else. We all have that tendency. If God doesn't bug us about it 24/7, then we kind of start thinking to ourselves, well, maybe God didn't really mean it. Maybe God's changed his mind. Maybe it wasn't that important to God in the first place. And we'll just delay and delay into the point where we conveniently forget that God ever said anything in the first place. So delaying is not a tactic that we want to take on. It's not something we want to do when God asks us to obey. And the last thing I saw is that he did obey. The request would have been illogical to Abraham. Despite his worldview, despite the promise, it still would have been illogical. And actually, because of the promise, it probably would have been an illogical request. He could have sat there and said, well, God, that doesn't make sense. How can Isaac have descendants if I kill him? Instead, he just obeyed and trusted that God would figure that part out. And that takes us back to our verse in Hebrews where the author tells us that Abraham trusted that God would raise him from the dead. He obeyed and just trusted that God would figure out the parts that didn't make sense to him. And that's really hard. Our human nature screams against sometimes being obedient because it's illogical. And so we have to trust God. And where we don't trust God, obedience will get us to that point. If we'll obey, then we'll find out at the end that God solves these problems. And that increases our trust. When our trust is increased, we're more apt to obey. And then when we obey, and we see how God solves it, we have more trust. And so it becomes a cycle. Obedience, trust, obedience, trust, obedience, trust. But at some point, the first part is we have to step out in obedience so that we can begin to trust. And so that's what Abraham does in this situation. It doesn't make sense. It's illogical, but he trusts. He has the promise, and so he obeys and trusts that God will figure out the rest of it. Here's a great example I could think of. Let's say God promises you that you're going to be wealthy. And you work and you work and years go by and you're no more wealthy than you were than the day God gave you that promise. And so you're kind of wondering when this promise is going to come about, how God's going to make this promise come about. He hasn't told you to switch jobs or get a new second job or anything like that. And then one day, they're having a party for you at the office for some reason, it's your birthday or something, and someone gives you a couple of lottery tickets. And in those lottery tickets is the multi-million-dollar winner. Now you can't be more thankful because you know now God has answered that promise. God promised you you'd be wealthy, and here in your hand is a multi-million-dollar lottery ticket. Now what are you going to do with that ticket? Probably the first thing you're going to do is run and go put it in a safe. If you've got a safe at home, a fireproof safe, that's where that lottery ticket's going, right? You're going to put it away and keep it safe. Then you're going to start making plans to get down to Santa Fe, to the lottery headquarters, to collect it. But you're going to be careful in your plans, how you're going to get there, to make sure you don't get hurt, to make sure the ticket doesn't fly out the car when you open the door, roll down the window. You're going to be careful who you tell that you have that ticket, because you don't want to take the risk that somebody's going to steal it. I mean, that ticket now is very precious. You're very excited about it. God has answered his prayer. So how would you feel the next morning? You get up, you get ready to head out to Santa Fe, and God says, oh, we take that ticket, and I want you to go light a fire, and I want you to throw that ticket in the fire. That's not a logical request, is it? I mean, God, you're the one who promised that I would be wealthy. And you answered the prayer by giving me the ticket. And now you want me to throw it in the fire? Well, our response should be not to debate, not to delay, but to just trust that God will figure out how to solve putting that ticket back together or making you wealthy some other way. So Abraham has given us a great way of understanding how to respond to a test. We may still struggle with the fact that God would ask such a thing of a person. But one of the things we can understand is that testing is going to be hard in some cases. And we don't want anything to cause us to fail a test. So we want to respond without delay, without debate, and just trust that God will solve all the problems and keep his promises. So I pray God finds all of us strong this week and helps us through all of our tests in life. Amen.